Do Western military installations in Africa really have no replacement? Captain Ibrahim Traore from Burkina Faso is ready to refute that idea. But is he ready to deal with the consequences after previous leaders like Thomas Sankara paid a high price? And if so, which country might provide military support to Burkina Faso? Let's investigate. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, has made a historic decision that has drawn attention from all around the world. He has allied Burkina Faso with two countries that have long been known for their resistance to Western domination by accepting Cuban and Venezuelan troops. The defense and independence of Burkina Faso are at stake in this choice. The West has used military alliances and economic dependency to maintain control over Africa for many years. Traoré's behavior makes a strong statement. Like Cuba and Venezuela, Burkina Faso is prepared to assert its independence, even if it means severing ties with wealthy countries that still view Africa as a subservient partner. So why should the West be concerned about this decision? Because the underpinnings of Western influence in Africa are being challenged by this coalition. If Burkina Faso can strengthen its economy and security through collaborations that advance true equality, it completely calls into doubt the necessity of Western aid. What's to stop other African countries from doing the same if one can thrive with non-Western allies? The foundation of Western power in Africa has frequently been a transactional one, offering military assistance in return for political influence or access to resources. However, Traoré's decision to form partnerships with nations that have successfully fought against Western hegemony for many years points to a possible move toward alliances based on respect for one another. Venezuela and Cuba don't have the same burdens as Western nations, which frequently have financial conditions attached. Rather, they provide a track record of solidarity with developing countries and a proven dedication to resilience. Is the West ready for an Africa that sets its own path? Traoré's partnership is probably viewed by many in Western capitals as a danger to their interests on the continent. It's an obvious message. Burkina Faso won't be used as a pawn in some one person's game. In this new period, African nations are free to reshape alliances according to their own preferences, unencumbered by the political and economic restrictions frequently imposed by the West. This change may spur a wave of African independence that upends the West's long-standing domination and reshapes the continent's place in the world. But why are Venezuela and Cuba favored? Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Please do not forget to subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's continue. Burkina Faso's pick of Venezuela and Cuba as allies may seem unusual to some. Alliances should, after all, be founded on geographic closeness or economic strength. However, this has a deeper metaphorical significance. Two countries that have continuously resisted Western domination are Cuba and Venezuela, particularly that of the United States, and exhibit incredible fortitude in the face of sanctions and blockades. Their stories speak to the African experience of colonization and exploitation, and they show what it means to maintain one's independence in the face of outside pressure. Venezuela and Cuba both have strong anti-imperialist sentiments. They have created self-sufficient systems and resisted Western meddling as the cornerstones of their national identities. There is more to Burkina Faso's alliance with these nations than merely providing military assistance. It's about forming alliances with countries that share similar values and recognize the benefits and drawbacks of independence. It conveys the idea that Burkina Faso prioritizes its sovereignty over pacifying established forces. By forming this coalition, Traoré is demonstrating his belief that his nation should not rely on Western approval to determine its direction. Furthermore, Both nations have shown that it is possible to live and even prosper without the consent or assistance of the West. For example, in spite of some of the most severe economic sanctions in contemporary history, Cuba has established a globally acclaimed healthcare system that excels in fields such as physician training and preventative medicine. Despite facing many Western sanctions, Venezuela, a country with abundant resources and energy expertise, is nevertheless working toward economic independence. Burkina Faso will also benefit practically from this partnership. A nation looking to lessen its reliance on outside forces can benefit greatly from the guerrilla warfare, sanctions resilience, and indigenous defense system building skills of Cuba and Venezuela. Venezuela's energy plans and Cuba's medical aid, for example, can help Burkina Faso build industries essential to independence without requiring Western aid, which frequently has strings attached. The goal is to create a defense and economic system that can function on its own, a respite from the dependency cycles that have afflicted many African countries. These two countries also have a lot to offer Burkina Faso. The partnership between Burkina Faso and Venezuela extends beyond military assistance. The debt-driven reliance model that Western countries advocate is directly challenged by this roadmap for economic freedom. Many African countries have historically depended on loans and financial assistance from Western governments and organizations, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These loans frequently have terms that affect national policies, making it challenging for nations to behave in their own best interests. Western financial institutions frequently provide aid that keeps nations in cycles of dependency rather than fostering long-term self-sufficiency. For instance, the African Development Bank reported in 2023 that 40% of sub-Saharan African nations were dependent on Western financial aid and were in or at risk of being in debt difficulties. By collaborating with Cuba and Venezuela, Burkina Faso is completely eschewing this model in favor of self-reliance, skill transfer, and fair economic trade. Unlike conventional Western friends, Cuba and Venezuela have no intention of controlling Burkina Faso's riches or dictating its policy. Their assistance places a strong emphasis on local resource management and advancements in healthcare education. To lessen Burkina Faso's dependency on Western medical assistance, Cuba, for example, has already agreed to send medical experts to help the country develop a robust healthcare system. In the meantime, Burkina Faso has a route to sustainable development in this vital area thanks to Venezuela's experience in energy security. In a nation with frequent electricity shortages, such as Burkina Faso, the establishment of sustainable energy systems with Venezuelan assistance can drastically cut expenses and free up funds for other developmental requirements. Venezuelan and Cuban soldiers contribute tactics developed over years of fighting foreign meddling on the battlefield. These tactics, which emphasize infrastructural resilience, community defense, and guerrilla warfare, fit in nicely with Burkina Faso's goal of self-sustaining security. The West has taken notice of this relationship, particularly by former colonial nations that have always been interested in African issues. These countries, used to being overseers or benefactors, perceive Burkina Faso's alliance with two anti-imperialist countries as an existential threat to their power. Under the pretext of stability or counterterrorism, Western nations, especially the United States and France, have kept a sizable military presence in West Africa. However, the fact that Burkina Faso is forming new partnerships outside of this sphere of influence makes it necessary to reconsider who stands to gain the most from this military presence. Should we be surprised that the West would be worried? After all, the fundamental foundation of Western aid is called into question if African countries are able to achieve peace and independence without Western intervention. The deployment of Venezuelan and Cuban forces represents a change in the balance of power, a departure from reliance on Western military and financial assistance, and a move toward partnerships based on respect for one another. This is troubling to the West, because it shows that Africa can actually establish its independence without depending on former colonial countries. This partnership may potentially act as a model for other African countries. Countries that observe Burkina Faso's audacious approach may come to the realization that they, too, have the option to form alliances that promote genuine sovereignty as opposed to imposing reliance. If this change picks up steam, might signal a dramatic shift in the balance of power on the continent, casting doubt on the justification of Western interventionist measures and prompting additional African countries to reconsider their relationships. However, the West is not known for relinquishing power easily. Western nations may try to influence African governments or public opinion by presenting these coalitions as a danger to regional stability or advancement. In actuality, the stability of Africa is not threatened by this realignment. Rather, it only threatens Western dominance. Ironically, people who profess to favor a continent's freedom see its quest for sovereignty as destabilizing. In addition to being deceptive, this framing implies a paternalistic view of African autonomy. What are the new partnerships going to mean in the long run? Traoré's partnerships with Cuba and Venezuela are seen by many Africans as a potential future in which African countries value independence over reliance. This partnership is not a one-off occurrence. It is indicative of a larger movement in African geopolitics, which rejects Western domination in favor of alliances founded on respect, equality, and similar ideals. Like Burkina Faso's recent alliances, South-South cooperation is more than just a political gimmick. It's a workable approach that can assist African countries in meeting their demands for sustainable development, technological innovation, and economic diversification. According to an African Union research, nations that participate in South-South cooperation tend to have more sustained growth than those that rely on aid from the West. With this strategy, countries can combine resources and knowledge without the political and financial restrictions that are frequently associated with Western assistance. However, this does not imply that Traoré's route is risk-free. Choosing to support Venezuela and Cuba exposes oneself to criticism and perhaps reprisals from Western nations. But many Africans identify with Traoré's position because it reflects a spirit of perseverance and sovereignty. Burkina Faso is establishing a precedent by lowering its reliance on Western powers, which may change African diplomacy and inspire other countries to look at achieving independence. Could a wider movement around the continent be sparked by Burkina Faso's position? The significance of the relationship lies in this question. A new age of African diplomacy, where nations collaborate to address regional issues without depending on former colonial powers, may emerge if more African countries pick partnerships that value sovereignty above dependency. What will the West do with this new coalition, even though we have discussed how it would use it? Western powers are already discussing economic penalties, a well-known tactic used to keep control in response to Burkina Faso's shift away from Western dominance. However, don't you think these sanctions show more about the insecurity of the West than the disobedience of Burkina Faso? After all, why would Burkina Faso's relationship with Venezuela and Cuba elicit such a reaction if it is genuinely inconsequential? Cuba and Venezuela are familiar with the use of sanctions, and they have modified their economies to resist outside pressure. These partnerships offer Burkina Faso not only moral support but also helpful advice on how to handle and lessen the effects of any sanctions. Burkina Faso is strengthening its resilience in vital areas and lessening its susceptibility to outside economic pressures with help from Venezuela in the energy sector and Cuba in the healthcare sector. Burkina Faso is strengthening its economy and reducing its dependency on Western assistance and approval by learning from the experiences of its allies. The fact that Western nations respond to African autonomy with punitive actions rather than encouragement is instructive, isn't it? This response demonstrates unease with the concept of a fully autonomous Africa. Sanctions, though, might not work as planned. People in Burkina Faso may view these actions as an assault on their nation's right to self-determination, which would increase support for Traoré's government. Burkina Faso's independence may be suppressed by Western sanctions, but the partnerships with Cuba and Venezuela provide a resilient roadmap that, if successful, may inspire other African countries to think about alternatives to Western assistance. What would happen if Africa severed its connections with the West? This is a crucial question. Africa would probably undergo a change unlike anything the continent has witnessed recently if it severed all relations with the West. Africa's potential has been stifled for far too long by exploitative economic practices, Western dependency, and unrelenting depletion of resources that ought to have supported the continent's wealth, instead of boosting those of others. For a brief moment, picture Africa free from Western influence, with complete authority over its resources, laws, and economic destiny. How would that appear? It's a vision of extraordinary empowerment, regional integration, and self-determination. Let's start by discussing the prevalent Western belief that Africa requires Western assistance or collaborations in order to progress. This claim is merely a holdover from a colonial mentality that was based on antiquated paternalism and believed Africa couldn't function on its own. Western aid has frequently been accompanied by significant conditions such as economic policies that favor foreign investment over domestic businesses, which feeds a vicious circle of reliance. Breaking these connections would enable Africa to concentrate on what really counts, establishing strong networks for intracontinental trade, and putting money into domestic businesses that directly help Africans instead than boosting Western profits. After all, why should oil, diamonds, and coffee from Africa be exported for pennies just to be resold at exorbitant prices? An independent Africa could establish reasonable prices and guarantee that the money made from its resources remains in the continent, which would benefit its citizens. This young worker is employed in a Burkina Faso gold mine. Burkina Faso is among the world's poorest countries. France prints colonial coinage for gold-rich Burkina Faso. Conversely, it asserts that 50% of all Burkina Faso exports wind up in the French treasury's coffers. The majority of the gold that this toddler puts in a bin to retrieve ends up in the French government's coffers. Critics also frequently point out that maintaining stability in Africa requires a Western military presence. This is a thinly veiled justification for control, defending military installations that largely serve Western interests under the pretense of stability. Upon closer inspection, it becomes evident that the existence of these bases has frequently made local problems worse rather than better. African countries might establish alliances that respect their sovereignty by escaping these so-called security agreements, possibly even with non-Western nations that are prepared to work with them without seeking control. Seldom has Africa been empowered by Western security systems. Rather, they have made Africa a pawn in international power struggles. In addition to protecting its territory and resources, an independent Africa might work with other African countries to create a common defense policy, enhancing regional cohesion and promoting an African identity independent of outside influences. Let's not be fooled by the flimsy claim that Western countries provide beneficial cultural and technological interaction. In actuality, African civilizations have long had a rich cultural legacy and a burgeoning tech sector with the capacity to compete with global hubs. It makes the assumption that Africa cannot foster its cultural renaissance or propel technological innovation from within. Africa might celebrate and invest in its own cultural identity without Western domination if it broke off its links with the West. Young Africans would be able to completely embrace their ancestry with this independence, which would improve morale and foster cross-border solidarity. Furthermore, severing connections with the West does not equate to seclusion. Instead, it gives Africa the opportunity to form bonds with allies that respect and cooperate with one another. Consider the possible alliances that might form with countries in South America, Asia, and perhaps Africa itself. freed from the frequently exploitative structures that the West has imposed. Through these relationships, Africa might become a strong global bloc that is viewed as an equal rather than a dependent. Africa has long been unable to establish its own environmental standards due to Western influence, which puts African ecosystems ahead of corporate profits. Africa has been particularly affected by pollution and biodiversity loss as a result of Western firms' frequent disregard for environmental effects in the name of resource extraction. By taking charge, Africa may set up an environmental agenda that puts an emphasis on eco-friendly behaviors, safeguarding its ecosystems, and leading green projects that are suited to the particular requirements of the continent. Critics may continue to argue that breaking up ties would present impossible obstacles. However, this argument fails to acknowledge Africa's tenacity and the strong push for self-sufficiency that is already gaining traction throughout the continent. Without the West, Africa wouldn't only survive, it would take charge of its future. It would flourish in a genuine, long-lasting, and entirely unique way. Shutting doors is not the goal of severing connections with the West. It involves creating new ones that pave the way for a future molded by Africa's vision for itself. Thus, in conclusion, Burkina Faso has more than just strategic connections with Cuba and Venezuela. They represent a fresh take on African sovereignty. The Western domination that has traditionally influenced Africa's geopolitical environment is being challenged by this alignment. Burkina Faso's efforts could serve as a potent model for other African countries attempting to claim their independence. Is a new era of African autonomy about to begin? Will other countries join Burkina Faso? What will happen when the West completely leaves Africa? Is the West really needed in Africa? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.